I think in the beginning we should be clear about that Assad Bay was Lev Nusimbaum. He was born in Kiev in 1905 and had Jewish parents. In Germany he converted to Islam in 1922, and there he assumed the name Assad Bay, which is no pseudonym. It is, as many people do when they change their religions, a new name. However, he became a very successful writer, but the German authorities always knew he was Lev Nusimbaum, although his books were always published under Assad Bay. But still, he seemed to have been protected for a while, because there is one letter, I can't remember now if it is written by the Gestapo to the Minister of Internal Affairs or the other way around, but the Gestapo was involved, and they say that the Jew Assad Bay has written very important books for the anti-Bolshevik propaganda, Stalin and GPU. So we will refrain from any measures against him for being Jewish. It's very interesting. But still, 1935, he was excluded from the German Writers' Union. That means he has lost his income, his books couldn't be sold anymore. That's why in 1936 he started talking to Ernst Peter Thal of the Thal Publishing House. Why? Because Thal already had experience in publishing so-called unwanted authors under false names, under pseudonym, and register these false names under a non-Jewish person. And so it happened that they registered the name Kurban Said under Assad Bay's close friend Elfriede Ehrenfels. We can see this in the book contract, and we can see this in the catalog, in the book catalog. The book was released in July 1937, and it was a success for the publishing house. But we can say that during the war or after the war, the book became forgotten. So, and if a woman called Almut Gittermann had not found the book in an antiquarian bookshop after the war and had taken this book with her when she moved to England, where she assumed a new name, Jamia Graham, and hadn't translated this book, probably we would not know this book today, because she was instrumental in the rediscovery of this beautiful novel. So her translation was published by the London publishing house Hutchinson's in 1970. So here we can say this is stage one from Vienna to London. And there it went to New York. 1 year later, the book was published in New York City. So, as it is often the case, book publications done in America have much more influence in the world than if they are published in London. The problem was that they didn't know who was Kurban Said. But when the book came to New York City and was published by Random House in April 1971, and newspapers started printing book reviews, person number one came forth, and that was Assad Bay's old Berlin classmate, Alexander Breilov, who had lived now in upstate New York and was a professor for literature by that time. And when he read the book review, he could sense that the person they were looking for was his old friend, Assad Bay. So he wrote a letter to Random House, and they were very convinced of the things he said, because he could describe his life, his character, and he also gave some clues about the plot of the story, who the Armenian Nahararian was in real life, and so forth. But Breilov, in fact, was not the first one who has written to Random House. 1 month earlier, 2 Azerbaijanis who lived in Washington, D.C. had already written to Random House. They also had found the book Ali and Nino via a book review, the book review in the Washington Star. And they bought a copy for themselves. And as they told the story later, they read the book head by head during one night. And they were startled because they knew names of streets, palaces, people, history. And they didn't know who the author was. But when morning broke and when the sun came up, they knew it was Yusuf Vezir Çamenzaminli. And there is even one more curiosity about it, because after they wrote to Random House, they wrote a letter to a journalist of the New York Times. They wanted to invite this journalist to speak to Türkgücül and Karaman. And in this letter, it says, so that next morning, that morning after the sun came up, the Azerbaijanis and the Georgians of New York City held a very excited meeting, and they decided the author was Yusuf Vezir Çamenzaminli. So the next thing that happened was that this journalist of the New York Times wrote an article based on the information given by Türkgücül and Karaman, and this article had the headline, "The Last Word, Who was the author of Ali and Nino?" So this article is full of Türkgücül and Karaman's arguments, but this article was read by another woman who lived in New York, and this woman was Hertha Pauli, and Hertha Pauli was Assad Bay's literary agent in Vienna between 1933 and 1938. So she wrote a letter to the New York Times, and New York Times said to Random House, "Hey, we have someone here." And actually Hertha Pauli said the same thing. The author was Assad Bay. She remembered the book. She remembered having talked to Assad Bay while he was writing the book, how he spoke about the book. She even said, no, he never made a secret of being Jewish in Vienna. It was no problem. So, and now we have Assad Bay's classmate and Assad Bay's literary agent. Of course, now Random House had 2 options, Çamenzaminli by Türkgücül and Karaman, or Assad Bay with the 2 witnesses who knew Assad Bay. So in fact, they decided to go with Brylov and Hertha Pauli. But the sad thing is that out of this meeting of the witnesses, nothing ever happened. There was no article written, no book was written. There was nothing for the future that researchers could ever refer to. So actually they came together, they agreed it was Assad Bay, they knew it was Assad Bay, but then the knowledge became forgotten. Quite the contrary to Türkgücül and Karaman. They were rejected in New York City, but they started talking to a Turkish journalist called Semih Yazıcıoğlu, and he was the translator of the novel Ali and Nino into Turkish. Interestingly enough, as I said, the book was published in New York in April 1971. Already in August 1971, the Turkish translation of Ali and Nino started to appear serialized in the Turkish newspaper Hürriyet. So that was very quick. I really wonder how it could have been so quick. Anyway, so Karaman, Türkgücül talked to Yazıcıoğlu. They gave him again their information, and Yazıcıoğlu wrote a foreword for his Turkish edition. And this foreword was the big bang of the Çamenzaminli theory. So this Turkish edition, with a foreword by Yazıcıoğlu, which had all the information about Çamenzaminli, came to Baku about 1 year later. And how it came to Baku and what had happened is a very interesting story. There was a young fellow in Erzurum. He was becoming a professor for literature, Ali Yavuz Akpenar. he read about the book in Hürriyet, and he bought it and he read it. And his friend was Professor Dr. Abbas Samanov in Baku. And because Akpenar knew that Samanov in Baku collected everything that had to do with Azerbaijan all over the world, he sent Samanov a letter saying, by separate post I mailed 2 copies of Ali and Nino to you, which had stirred a big interest in Turkey. And then we have letters of Samanov asking, where are the books? The books didn't arrive. And Akpenar told me about 15 months ago that he had to go about 8 or 9 times to the post office in Erzurum and mail books to Samanov in Baku. What had happened? As I said, Samanov was known for collecting materials about Azerbaijan from all over the world. That means he had international contacts. And therefore, his mail was surveyed by the KGB. So the Secret Service, they scanned his incoming mail. They found the book, they could read it, it was in Turkish. They saw that the book was, if not anti-Bolshevik, it was at least anti-Russian. And they saw that, obviously, the writer is Chaman Zaminli. And what had happened next was that the sons of Chaman Zaminli, Orhan and Fikret Vezirov, they received phone calls from the KGB. There is one television documentary where Fikret Vezirov really says it in front of the camera. They called us, we knew it was the KGB. And they were very afraid. The problem was they didn't know anything about the book. They didn't have anything in the archives of the family. No one ever has heard in the family about this novel. In their fear of the KGB, the Vezirov family turned to Professor Abbas Samanov, who was known as the #1 expert in Azerbaijani literature, and they asked for advice. They asked him to help prove that their father hadn't written the book. And for Samanov, who had in the meantime obviously received a copy of Ali and Nino and read it, for him it was obvious. His judgment was neither the stylistic devices of the novel nor the periods of stay of Chaman Zaminli in Europe allow such a possibility that he was the author. Furthermore, he said that Türkokul had already written a book about Hüseyin Javid in 1963, in which he propagated similar unscientific notions. So, Samanov's judgment was beyond doubt. Obviously, the KGB left the family alone. What happened next was that nothing happened because it was more or less quiet for 20 years. Only after the independence of Azerbaijan, new interest came up in the origin of the novel Ali and Nino. This interest was stirred by Mirza Khasar's translation from German into Azerbaijani. And of all people, it was the sons of Chaman Zaminli who warmed up the old idea that their father was the author of Ali and Nino. So obviously the fears from 25 years earlier were forgotten. So now you may ask yourself, how do I know this story? In my over 10 years of research, I hunted down and collected correspondence between people who were involved in the rediscovery of Ali and Nino from the 1970s until the 1990s. And when I found the correspondence by Ahmed Schmiede, who happened to be a friend of Abbas Samanov, who had asked Schmiede to search for Kurban Said in Germany, I read the name Sultan Tulu, Professor Dr. Sultan Tulu, a Turkish professor in Muğla in Turkey. Schmiede had already passed away when I found his correspondence, so I turned to Dr. Tulu. And she told me that when she met Schmiede, he told the story of what happened in the 1970s. He said to her that the sons of Cemen Zemilli were so scared of the KGB that they turned to Abbas Samanov for help, that he may prove that the father was not the author of Ali and Nino. And in fact, there is another source I have, because the English translator Genia Graham at one point also was in contact with Ahmed Schmiede. And I think it was in 1974 where she wrote a letter to Schmiede complaining about all sorts of things, about all the lies in Yazıcıoğlu's foreword, and was complaining. And she said, then she concluded, yeah, but what is all this against the suffering which was put on the family of Cemen Zemilli because of these lies? Now, I don't know why she knew about it and from whom, but obviously she knew about it. And even more, one of my new acquaintances in Baku is a professor for literature, and he told me that one of the Cemen Zemilli sons said to him about 25, 30 years ago that Abbas Samanov, he always used to be against our father. So these things happen when the wind changes.